Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, polls suggest that the Governor of the Bank of England could have more influence on undecided voters than any of the leading politicians on either side in the great EU debate. But he's walked into the lion's den with his warnings that a vote to leave the EU could lead to another recession. Hysterical, over the top, undignified, complained the Out campaign, with one Tory MP demanding his immediate resignation. Notably unresigned, Mr. Carney is with me now. Now, you're looking very, very dapper and very cool, but a huge torrent of verbal ordure, has poured on your head since you took this decision. And I've read some of the quotes, there are plenty more. You may have heard Andrea Leadsom saying it was a very dangerous thing to do. So why, in short, did you feel that you had the right, and indeed possibly the duty, to wade into what is a British political argument?
Well, first thing to say, Andrew, thanks for having me on. Understand there's a lot of passion on all sides of this debate. Central banking isn't a passionate business. It's subjective, it's analytic, it's evidence-based, and the judgments we take, and I would emphasize the we, these are judgments taken by independent committees, 9 members on the Monetary Policy Committee. Those judgments are carefully considered. And those judgments only reflect our remits, our mandates, the issues we have to deliver. So we have to deliver the inflation target. We have to look out over...
So you can talk about inflation and so forth, but not about sovereignty.
Exactly. The issues around the referendum are much, much broader than the issues that concern the Bank of England. So when we look, and the Monetary Policy Committee with the most recent forecast, its most recent decision, and crucially, its most recent letter to the Chancellor about bringing inflation back to target, we have to talk about the trade-off between inflation and growth. And that trade-off could be very different in a scenario if the UK were to remain in the European Union versus one if it were to leave.
Sure, but you're a very un-naive observer of the scene. By doing this, you have linked yourself very, very closely to the Chancellor, George Osborne, and the Treasury View, and yet you are supposed to be independent.
We're absolutely independent. It is an independent committee, and we're not linked to the bigger questions about the longer-term economic impact of being in or out. What we're doing is we're identifying risks around leave, and we're taking steps as an institution to mitigate those risks.
But there are risks both ways, and yet you focused on the risks only of leaving.
No, that's not true. Our central forecast is for remain. We always take government policy. That's the standard approach of the Bank of England. And our central forecast is for that. And we go in great detail on the risks around that.
And we're going to come on to that. I'm glad you said that. But before we do, Lord Lamont, former Chancellor, can't be dismissed, talks about the daily avalanche of institutional propaganda is becoming ludicrous, he says, and pitiful. Important institutions are being politicised, I think he's talking about the Bank of England here, and used to make blood-curdling forecasts. A governor should be careful that he doesn't cause a crisis. That's fair enough, isn't it?
Well, it's fair enough. We have learned in the United Kingdom from past mistakes. High variable inflation, the debacle of the ERM exit. The lesson from that was to adopt inflation targeting, brilliantly executed by my predecessor, Lord King. The lesson of the financial crisis, the run-up to the financial crisis, was to give an institution responsibility for identifying risks, not to cross your fingers and hope that risks would go away or everything would be all right on the night, but to identify the issues, come straight with the British people about them, and then take steps to mitigate them. What brings those two approaches together, those two big lessons of the last quarter century, is transparency. And so we don't just have a responsibility to the British people to be fair and not pop up after a vote and say, oh, by the way, this is what we thought.
We thought at the time.
Yeah, at the time. But we also have a responsibility to explain risks and then take steps, because by explaining them, by explaining what we would do to mitigate them, we reduce them. And that is the key point. Ignoring a risk is not to reduce it.
And so if transparency is so important, and presumably you discuss all of the aspects of this in the Monetary Policy Committee, why not publish the minutes? They're meant to be kept secret for 8 years, which is ridiculous.
The minutes are published. We published the minutes on Thursday. You can see in the minutes.
All the arguments.
We can see the arguments, the issues in the minutes. They're detailed in the letter to the Chancellor as well. They're detailed in the Monetary Policy Report. Central banking has changed in the last 25 years. This is part of the change. Now you will get, you're right, in 8 years, the verbal transcripts of what's actually said, not 25 years like under
but they won't be very different from the minutes we can see now.
Absolutely not. And I fully hope to be still be alive. I won't be in British public life at that point, but I will be. And you can cross-check everything it says. And also, may I make this point? All the analysis behind those judgments will also be published.
Jacob Rees-Mogg, who is a Tory MP taken seriously in the House of Commons, called on you to resign as a result of this. When you saw all the headlines and you saw the reaction, was there a moment when you thought, do you know what, I think I have overstepped the mark?
No, absolutely not. Central banks are independent in very specific areas for a reason. It's precisely not to bend to political pressure from any side and to make clear, objective judgments and then explain those judgments. And we have a duty, if we're taking a judgment as a committee and we're changing policy because of it, we're putting out billions of pounds of liquidity facilities, we're getting banks to raise capital as we did a few years ago against these types of risks, if we're potentially going to alter the path of interest rates or other instruments of monetary policy because of certain things manifesting, we have a duty to explain that to the British people and to Parliament. And can I go back to one of your earlier points about daily avalanche? No. The bank's comments on these issues have been in the context of testimony to the House of Lords, testimony to the Commons committees, and inflation reports and associated press conferences around those reports. So it's in our daily business.
Your job, as it were. Now, turning to the actual state of the economy and what the report says, if you look at the OBR, one of the points they make is that Britons have never been more over-borrowed for longer than we are now. I think £58 billion of borrowing net by British households at the moment, going up to £68 billion by the end of the decade. That must be a really, really serious threat to an economy which is still not growing very fast.
Well, okay, there's several things there. First, I think we should look at the expansion as a whole. This has been the strongest growing economy up until very recently in the G7. Secondly, in terms of the borrowing position of British households, relative to their incomes, British households have worked hard and paid down debt. So it's gone from about 160% of income to about 135.
But that's tailed off now, hasn't it?
It has now tailed off. And so this is something that
we are still
watching.
Quite heavily borrowed. And the reason I'm asking about this, of course, is this is all based on a world where we don't really have interest rates anymore. So presumably the worry is when you have to put interest rates back up again, assuming we stay inside the EU, we could then face a kind of raft of repossessions and people being in terrible trouble, as they were in the 1980s. You remember the negative equity and stuff that we faced then. Are we heading towards something like that now because of overborrowing?
Well, I remember, I lived here at that time, and I remember it very well. I remember that the levels of uncertainty in the early 1990s are the same as the levels of uncertainty today in this economy, which is one of the reasons why the economy is slowing right here as we sit. In terms of borrowing and the ability to pay back, one of the things we've done as the new Bank of England is to say to banks and building societies is when somebody takes out a new loan, don't just test them against today's interest rate, test them against interest rates where they could go, in fact, 3 percentage points higher than they are today,
but
to make sure that we don't...
lending, like, you know...
Well, they're lending where they're lending. The big increase in borrowing right now has been for car purchase, and there's been much more lease contracts for cars. So there is an element of security around that point. It is something, it is without question, Andrew, it's something we're watching.
If you have to put up interest rates well, we can talk about Brexit. If we leave the EU and the pound falls and there's an inflationary pressure and you have to put up interest rates, what then happens to the over-borrowed British public?
Well, what history shows is that the British public pays their debts. It's not like the U.S. public. The British public pays their debts. The challenge and the thing we're trying to manage to the medium term is to ensure that not too many of the British public are, as you say, over-borrowed, because that will make a downturn that much more severe. We would take a judgment, whether it's remain, leave, some other shock happens to the economy, as inevitably it will. We'll take a judgment about interest rates, taking into account the borrowing position of households, but also the overall level of inflationary pressures. And all of those judgments, like our judgments that we made this past week, both about leave and remain, are in the horizon of 2 to 3 years, which is our relevant horizon.
Let's come back to what you were saying about a possible Brexit this week. First of all, can I be clear, this is about a short-term shock. You're not trying to make judgments about whether the British economy would be stronger or less strong in or out of the EU in several years' time.
You're absolutely right. That is a judgment of which we are capable of making, but we will not make because it is not our mandate to make.
So you use lots of coulds and woulds and perhapses in your report. Similarly, it is perfectly possible that we leave the EU, and because of less regulation and because of the 10 billions a year that we have to spend on the NHS and so forth that Andrea Leadsom was talking about, and because we have our new trade deals with other countries, we could actually be better off as an economy.
Okay, so you're just trying to get me to contradict what I just said, which is to make a judgment about the longer-term economic prospects for the economy, which is, again, a judgment which we're capable of making at the Bank of England, but it's not our mandate, so we won't and I won't. What we can make a judgment, what we have to make a judgment about, is that near term, that medium term, 2 to 3 years out. And a sense, as you rightly point, it's in the conditional, it's could, should, would, but there are a number of indicators that back up those points.
And to be clear, what you fear happening is the pound falling in value, and as a result of that, inflation being imported into the economy, growth slowing, and you talk about the possibility of what you call a technical recession. Now, again, to people watching this programme who don't know what a technical recession is or might feel like, it may not sound too bad, a technical recession. It's only a technical recession, it's not a real one. What would it feel like?
Well, look, the technical definition of a technical recession is just that. It's 2 quarters of flat or negative growth. So it doesn't necessarily have the broader connotation. So to be absolutely clear, what our judgment is as a risk is that growth will be materially slower and inflation notably higher in event of a leave, because
that means fewer jobs, lower wages, businesses going out of business.
It can have those consequences, absolutely. Now, what we have to do is make a judgment about the appropriate stance of monetary policy, and the key point to get across in advance is to markets and to others is that you have conflicting forces. You have upward pressure on inflation, potentially from movements in currency markets. You have downward pressure, potentially from people deferring some consumption or investment because of uncertainty until things settle down. And you also, as a consequence of that, have less productivity in the economy for a period of time. In part because of that lower investment. So we have to take all that together.
That is something we would all notice, of course.
We would notice, and it's something that we would, sorry, Andrew, but we note in advance, we make as clear as possible in advance how we might react to that.
All right.
And that gets more of the work done and less of the surprise in markets and other places. See, this is the difference between denial and transparency.
Your critics, as you may have heard Andrea Leadsom say again, also say the bank has not been very good at forecasting over the last period. That you said that interest rates would go up when unemployment hit 7%.
I didn't say that, Andrew. We said, just to be clear, we said that we wouldn't even begin to think about raising interest rates until unemployment got to 7%. And then we would take stock. And the reason we said that is we felt there was more supply capacity in the economy. The economy had more potential. And we were absolutely right in that inference.
Okay.
Let me make an important point.
Questions, if I could.
The big calls in terms of did this economy have more supply potential? Absolutely. Big call, should interest rates stay lower for longer? Absolutely, we got them right. We get the big calls right. You want to quibble about decimal places with the strongest recovery in the G7?
Very quickly, is it conceivable, is it possible that we will see negative interest rates in this country? Actually paying the banks to hold our money?
It is highly, highly unlikely. Look, we have space for any eventuality in normal interest rate policy. What we're focused on is returning to normal.
Mark Carney, thank you very, very much indeed for joining us today.